My name is Kitty Douglas, and I'm so excited to welcome everyone and Lauren Kunis to BigTent. At BigTent USA, we put democracy above partisanship. We're a national women-led coalition dedicated to protecting democracy, women's reproductive rights, and our children and grandchildren's future through education and civic engagement. Lauren Kunis has spent her career working to strengthen democracy at home and around the world, designing and managing impactful voter education, civic engagement, and government accountability programs. Lauren most recently worked at the nonprofit Vote, where she is the National Voter Registration Day program and led the holiday to a record-setting number of voter registrations in 2020. So thank you for that, Lauren. We really needed that. She previously worked at the nonpartisan National Democratic Institute and the World Bank on democracy and governance programs in over 15 countries in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. Domestically, Lauren has worked on national political campaigns, served on the steering committee for the DC Paid Family Leave campaign, and worked as a New York City Urban Fellow in the Bloomberg administration before becoming the CEO of VoteRiders. So with that, Lauren, thank you so much for coming to BigTent, and take it away.
Yes, thank you so much, Kitty, for having me, and welcome everyone. Really excited to be here today and talk to you about VoteRiders, about our issue of focus, which is, of course, voter ID, and hopefully leave you all with some exciting ways to plug into our work and make a difference in this big election year. So moving right along. Okay, you call that advanced, right? Slide-wise, we're good? Okay, excellent. So I know many of you are friends of VoteRiders already. For those who are not yet, I'll do a quick introduction. VoteRiders is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working on the issue of voter ID. I really liked what you said, Kitty, about putting democracy over partisanship. I often say our work is not partisan, it is patriotic. We are committed to ensuring that every eligible American is able to exercise their freedom to vote. We have been at this work for going on 12 years. We were founded by attorney Kathleen Unger in 2012 as a response to an increase in voter ID laws across the country. We work year-round, online, and on the ground to make sure that voters know what ID they need to cast a ballot and know how to be in touch with us if they need help getting an ID. We work in a couple big program buckets. The first is voter education. We do lots of digital campaigns, lots of text banking and letter writing and trainings to make sure that every voter includes ID as part of their plan to vote. We work individually with any eligible voter to make sure they have the ID and underlying document they need to register and vote successfully. And we also meet voters where they are, which increasingly is online. We do lots of communications and digital campaigns through the media, through content and influencer partnerships on platforms like TikTok. We do radio PSAs, we do movie theater PSAs to make sure that we're getting the word out far and wide about voter ID. We are a national organization. Our resources are relevant for the entire voting public. That being said, we are focusing our field programs and our on-the-ground work this year in 8 states, and these are the 8 states listed here. These are states that are battleground states. Margins are going to be razor tight likely in November statewide or in certain congressional districts. And we know that the work that we do on the margins when it comes to voter ID, when it comes to activating and mobilizing some of the least likely voters, could be a difference maker. All of these states have restrictive voter ID laws in place, and almost all of them, we'll get more into this later, actually have new or stricter voter ID laws since the last presidential election in 2020. This is a big election year. We have big goals. We are seeking this cycle to reach 10 million voters directly with free ID education, resources, and assistance. So this breaks down into over 125,000 letters handwritten to at-risk voters, 5 million text messages, 2 million voter ID information cards, working with partners to get the word out, and lots more. I wanted to put this slide up here particularly for this group since I know we have so many partners and volunteers who have supported our work over the years. I often find myself saying that VoteRiders punches above our weight. And the way we do this is by so strategically working with a very diverse range of partner organizations. We work with, traditional voter engagement groups and also more non-traditional direct service providers like food banks and shelters. We have worked with over 1,500 partner organizations in the 12 years since we've been around, enlisted the support of over 10,000 volunteers who've collectively helped us reach millions of voters with the right ID information at the right time. Particularly in this era of mis and disinformation, our partners and volunteers serve a really crucial role as trusted messengers, providing credible and updated information on complicated voter ID laws. We provide resources to voters and offer a pathway to get the documents they need. And these documents allow them to register and vote successfully. Also, in many cases, they are truly life-changing. Getting an ID can open the door to more stable housing for your family, better employment opportunities, life-saving medical care, and much more. Okay, so voter ID laws and their potential impact on the 2024 elections. If you leave with one takeaway on the context, it is that ID-related barriers to the ballot box are growing. The voter ID landscape has changed quite dramatically since the last presidential election. In the 2021 to present day period, we have really seen an unprecedented explosion of voter ID laws across the country. At VoteRiders, this concerns us for lots of different reasons, but it should concern all of us from a democracy protection and promotion and expansion standpoint, because we know that these voter ID laws could directly disenfranchise millions of voters. We know that the harm they cause falls unequally on marginalized communities who are already underrepresented in our electorate. We also know the confusion and intimidation that will come from these changing voter ID laws across the country. This map has a lay of the land when it comes to voter ID laws today. Any state with a color is one of the 38 states that has a voter ID law in place. This is more states than ever before in our country's history with the voter ID law. The 17 states in kind of salmon-y color, orange, not sure what color that is. All of the orange states have new or stricter ID laws since 2020. In some states like North Carolina or Nebraska, it is a brand new voter ID law, full stop. In other states like Georgia or Florida or Texas, the change made an existing ID law even stricter, adding new ID requirements for mail-in voting. 34.5 million citizens do not have an unexpired and current, with their current name and address, driver's license or state ID. So this proportion is really huge when we think about who these laws could directly disenfranchise. I wanted to take a second to talk about the why these voter ID laws have passed at such an unprecedented pace. Probably won't surprise many of the folks on this call that we can draw really a direct and straight line between lies and misleading narratives about election integrity in 2020 and this explosion of so-called election integrity laws that passed across the country in the 2021 to present day period. I often say that voter ID finds itself sort of in the crosshairs in state legislatures, and it's often on the chopping block when it comes to concessions that legislators, even on the left, are more willing to make. Part of this is because public opinion is generally, over time and even across the aisle, broadly supportive of voter ID laws, We at VoteRiders feel that this is because the impact of voter ID laws is dramatically misunderstood by policymakers, by the media, and by the general public. We feel strongly that if there were a better understanding of the harm that these laws cause, we would not see public support for them, generally speaking, and we would not see them passing at such unprecedented rates nationwide. So what do you do to when you feel like you have a problem that is misunderstood, there isn't enough information? One way to counter that is with credible and updated data, sharing accurate information. So we at VoteRiders were really excited just a few weeks ago to release a new study we did in partnership with the Brennan Center for Justice, PublicWise, and the Center for Democracy and Civic Engagement at the University of Maryland. This was the first national study on voter ID access in almost 20 years. The last one was done by the Brennan Center in 2006. So we last fall did a survey of a representative sample of the US adult population. We oversampled certain demographic groups like young people and communities of color, low-income individuals, people who use prepaid cell phones, to make sure that we got an accurate read of ID access in those groups that we know are disproportionately impacted by ID laws. And we will walk through the results very quickly. For those of you who love to crunch numbers, rest assured that the full results will be sent to you by email. You can dig into the report. Some of the key findings, I mentioned this number earlier. 14.8% of voting age citizens in the United States, which translates to almost 35 million people by current census counts, do not have an unexpired driver's license or state ID with their current name and address on it. So this includes people who maybe have moved but haven't updated their ID yet, people who have changed their name but haven't gotten their documents ordered to reflect that new name. This is a staggering proportion of the population. It doesn't necessarily translate into 14.8% of people who will not be able to vote, but it is stunning when we think about the percentage of voting age citizens who may have voting difficulties in their state because of not having a current and updated government-issued photo ID. I alluded to this earlier, but once again, our research found that voter ID laws do not hit all demographic or age groups in the same way. Americans who are disproportionately less likely to have a current driver's license included youth, particularly the 18 to 19-year-old segment. The percentage who did not have a current driver's license was really eye-popping in the 40s. Black Americans, Latinx Americans, low-income citizens, those who have lower levels of education, are all far more likely to lack an updated form of ID. So way more than that 14.8% general population figure that I cited before. Young Black Americans are the least likely of any group to have a driver's license with current name and address on it. You see here, it's almost half that do not have a driver's license with up-to-date information on it. At VoteRiders, we often say that we are in the solutions business. So instead of just asking, do you have ID or not? We also, for those who did not, we asked why you do not have ID. We found almost 1 in 5 respondents, or 19%, identified solvable bureaucratic or economic factors as the reason for which they didn't have a form of ID. So this could be the cost of getting a license, not being able to pay tickets or reinstatement fees at the DMV, lack of time, or lack of underlying documents like a birth certificate or social security card. This is not good news. However, for VoteRiders, this was encouraging for us because this showed us that we can be part of the solution, and these are solvable problems that we are set up to address at scale across the country. Breaking it down by where people live, we found that 2 out of 10 Americans living in strict photo ID states, where that form of ID is required to vote at the polls, do not have a current driver's license. So that form of license that has that's not just unexpired, but that also has your current name and address on it. Another thing that we cannot talk enough about at VoteRiders is confusion. This is something that our team of 24 organizers across the country sees every single day. This patchwork of complicated and confusing and costly ID laws that Americans are grappling with today is causing widespread confusion. More than half of the Americans we surveyed who lived in states where a photo ID is required to vote at the polls did not know or were unsure of their state's law and didn't know that they would need to bring that specific type of ID to cast a ballot. This is something we see on our voter ID helpline all the time. Lots of Americans who live in non-voter ID states are also confused about their voter ID law and sometimes think they need to bring something to the polls that they actually don't need to do. We found that voters were even more confused about ID rules for vote by mail, which we know is a more popular post-pandemic voting option of choice for many. And we also, somewhat unsurprisingly, found that younger voters, newer voters, lower propensity or less frequent voters were also the least likely to be confident in their state's ID laws for voting in person and by mail. If you would like to get the full results of this survey, we have a blog post up on it that links you to the Maryland full report. We also, our legal director authored an op-ed in Democracy Docket middle of last month that includes sort of our analysis of the findings and highlights some solutions. So you can probably tell I love numbers. I can talk about numbers a lot. At the same time, numbers do not pull on your heartstrings the way that storytelling does. So another big part of our work at VoteRiders is capturing and amplifying and uplifting the stories of the voters, the real people that we help every single day across the country get an ID. This is a really important way for us to build empathy around our issue, to slowly contribute to changing hearts and minds around the issue of voter ID and voter ID laws, and help people understand that for many of their fellow citizens in crisis, an ID is something they need to vote and also really just thrive more broadly in life. We also use these stories to share the many different reasons for which someone might not have an ID, to sort of help everyone identify with or empathize with the challenges that voter ID laws place and the barriers they cause to the ballot box. So that concludes the doom and gloom portion of this talk. We're going to pivot now, not from the harm that voter ID laws might cause, but focus more on what we can do about it. I say this to our team a lot, and I say it to myself. We're all very focused on the margin of error and polling and trying to figure out what might come November. But we're also in the margin of effort. There's a lot of time between now and November, and a lot that we can all collectively do to make sure that we see broad and diverse participation across the country. So first things first, you need to make sure that you have a plan to vote. We have lots of up-to-date comprehensive resources on our website about ID rules for voting in your state, including in person and by mail. We encourage everyone to share these resources widely with your friends, your family, your community on social media. We've also built out specialized resources and landing pages on our site to talk through specific communities of voters and the ID challenges they might have and the resources we offer to address those challenges. So this includes trans and non-binary voters who often, when they have a name or a gender presentation that doesn't match their original documentation, have a lot of challenges and intimidation at the polls. Student voters, particularly those who attend college or university out of state, often have challenges with ID requirements at the polls. And voters with disabilities who may lack access to transportation to get to an ID issuing office, on top of all other challenges they might face. We have dedicated landing pages for those communities and work very closely with partner organizations who are very deeply entrenched in those communities to make sure those resources are getting to the right people. We have wallet-sized voter ID information cards for those of you who are affiliated with nonpartisan nonprofit organizations like a League of Women Voters chapter, for example. You can order these cards for free on our website at the link. I hope you can see that. I can't see it on my screen, but it's voteriders.org/cards. And you can order up-to-date wallet-sized cards to distribute at tables, on campuses, at churches, community centers, wherever voters are. These are handy ways to send a reminder that ID is required in many states to cast a ballot. We have lots of partnerships with groups that do direct voter contact. So this is canvassing, phone banking, text banking. Um, we work with groups to put a question about voter ID into their scripts. Then on a weekly or monthly or quarterly basis, they share lists back with us of voters they have encountered who have said no when asked, do you have current government issued photo ID? So we have a great partnership with Black Voters Matter in 11 states, for example, where they are canvassers, have a question about ID, and for anyone who says no, Black Voters Matter sends us the lists. We also have a great partnership with Rock the Vote, which does digital voter registration. They send us a list every single month of people who drop off at the exact point where they're asked to input ID information as part of the registration process. Our trained volunteers follow up with them right away to offer free ID help from our end. Last but not least, we have tons of volunteer opportunities. I know many of you are returning volunteers with VoteRiders. Thank you very much. And hopefully almost all of you or all of you will join us in our volunteer efforts going forward. We do lots of letter writing, phone banking, text banking, all year round to get voters the information they need about ID in their state and offer free help. I wanted to do a quick letter writing spotlight since I was told this morning BigTent USA volunteers sent over 6,000 handwritten letters to voters in 22, and you have already requested almost 3,000 letters this year alone. Letter writing works, in an era where we are all inundated with text messages and emails. Getting a handwritten letter really stands out. So in Texas, they implemented a new voter ID law in 2022 that led to an unheard of rate of ballot rejections in their March 1 primary. Over 25,000 ballots were rejected. So we at VoteRiders, with the help of our volunteers, got to work. Between April and October, we sent letters and text messages to over 15,000 of those 25,000. And we're so thrilled to report that almost all of them, 92% of people who received a letter from VoteRiders between April and October, after having their ballot rejected in March, successfully were able to make their voices heard in November's midterm election. Volunteers also man our helpline and chatbot. This 287% figure here is the increase in helpline calls and texts we got in 2023 relative to 2021, the last comparable election year. We're expecting a flood, an avalanche of confused voters calling and texting us this year. We provide lots of training to volunteers who want to help us respond to voter questions on the helpline. We also train volunteers to provide ID assistance to individual voters one-on-one, including both in person in the states where we have programs on the ground and virtually. This is a really rewarding way to work in depth one-on-one with people to help them figure out a way to get an ID, get to the ID issuing office. VoteRiders covers every single cost associated with that. And all of the volunteers who do this work have said it is incredibly gratifying to be able to help people in this very meaningful way. I said last but not least, but that was a lie. This is actually last but not least. VoteRiders is a nonprofit organization. We rely on the donations of individuals from all across the country at all different levels. I can personally vouch for the fact that our team is hard at work putting every single dollar to excellent use. So we would be honored if those of you who are able could make a personally meaningful contribution to VoteRiders to support our work this cycle. So with that, I wanted to say thank you. We have our social media handle across all platforms, VoteRiders listed here. Of course, check out our website if you have any questions. Our organizational email address is there. And I am happy to answer any and all questions. I am so grateful for you guys tuning in today, for your commitment to protecting democracy this year, and also to expanding it, to making sure that our voting public is diverse and representative and speaks for all of us. So thank you. I will stop my share and happy to have a conversation.
Lauren, thank you so much. That was incredible and very helpful and detailed. Before we get, there's some great questions in the chat that I definitely want to get to, but you did mention, and so I think it's worth people understanding better why voter ID is onerous and
Yeah.
why it's now a tool by those who want to suppress vote or make it harder to vote. It did sound like what you said after 2020, it's really gone, you know, on hyperdrive. And so I think it's really helpful for people to know, why voter ID and why it's I think you described it last time you came to Big Tent as like a double hurdle. Like the voter ID is used as a double hurdle. So just tell us why it's such a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel like many of us have lived in a sort of bubble where you got an ID as soon as you turned 16 and got a card, and got, the ability to drive. Something we see in our work every single day is that for millions of Americans, you know, the 2 hours and $100 it may take to get an ID is actually a very powerful barrier to the ballot box. For many of the individuals we assist, it's not just the ID document, it's also the underlying documents that you need, like a birth certificate or a social security card or a marriage or divorce certificate that shows the name change. We work with a lot of individuals who are our organizers call sort of stuck in the doom cycle, so to speak, where you can't get an ID until you have a birth certificate, but you can't find that and you don't know how to track it down. So a lot of times our volunteers and staff play the very valuable role of sort of, you know, um, bureaucratic navigator. In addition to paying the costs, we help people navigate pretty complicated and confusing and onerous government systems. And frankly, all of us, like no one wants to go to the DMV. It can be a less than pleasant experience. It can take a lot of time. Voter ID laws, it can take weeks or months to get the ID you need. They're also a pretty powerful and frankly scary tool for legislators who want to effectively cut off certain segments of the electorate from voting. We're a nonpartisan organization. I'm not here to assign motive or speculate. However, if you were a legislator who knew that you typically drew your support from older people, you might say, hey, student IDs are really appreciated by young people who might not be my base of support. So let's think about how to make it more complicated and challenging for them to cast a ballot. A stat I unfortunately uplift often is that in Texas, for example, you can use your handgun license to vote, but not your student ID. So I think these laws they almost allow legislators with surgical precision to target and disenfranchise certain groups of the electorate. They also send a really powerful message and a discouraging message if you're a young person who wants to use a student ID about who certain legislators want to vote and who they want to invite into the process and who they want to shut out.
Yeah, we just got Brenetta Ward just sent a quick message in the chat that she took her granddaughter to get a state approved ID last month. It cost $73. So I'd like you to talk about the expense of it, and also if you can sort of tell us how this works in other, democratic countries and how the United States differs around ID, because I think that's really also very important for people to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the United States, as with all things voting, it's hard to say the exact cost of an ID is this. That being said, if I had to sort of ballpark it, the average cost is about $75 to help someone get an ID. That is the document itself. It also, we have partnerships with Uber and Lyft who provide free transportation to and from ID issuing offices for individuals we support through our VoteRiders programs. That can be another $40 to $100 round trip. Time is also an important cost factor. Our partners at the Movement Advancement Project did a really excellent report kind of comparing and contrasting minimum wage in any given state to the average cost of an ID, to the average cost of an underlying document like a social security card. I'll pull up the link and drop it in the chat. But it's really a cost that many of us see as, an inconvenience and annoying, but for millions of Americans, that cost is a barrier that prohibits them from exercising, their citizenship derived freedom to vote. I can talk about differences in United States voting and elsewhere in the world for a really long time. That's not even joking, the topic of my book for someday. But the short answer, and I would always have this conversation with activists I was supporting overseas, the United States makes it incredibly hard to vote from every single perspective at every single level of the process. When you look at our voter registration, which in other countries is more automatic, it comes with just your citizenship right to vote. You don't have to actively opt into being a voter. The ID laws we have in the United States, like all of our voting laws, are exceptionally complicated and confusing. They vary by state. They are unequally enforced at the polls by poll workers. In many of the other countries where I have worked overseas, more nascent democracies even, you bring the equivalent of your citizenship card. Everyone has a national ID card that is accepted at the polls. And if you don't have it, you can sign a form that says you forgot it. It's an excuse form, and you can cast a regular ballot. So it is much easier almost at every step of the process in many other countries, which partially explains why our turnout rates in the United States by global comparative standards are not good. For a solid, very entrenched democracy, I feel like the fact that our turnout rates are so low is a direct result of how difficult we make it for people to vote at every level, at registration, at ID laws, having election day on a weekday, so many different reasons.
Okay, when you write that book, you got to come back. We'll give out 50 free copies, I promise, because
It's going
I
to be
think it's
post
really,
2024, but it is a dream
yeah.
of mine someday.
Okay, and you got little kids too, so
True.
okay,
When
so
you go to
you
college.
yeah, wait until they go to college. There's a question in the chat about why voter ID laws now, and you did reference that since 2020 election lies, we could go dark on that. But I want to take one state if possible, since it's a state that you're working in and it's a state that we care about and we've worked in as well. So I'd like you to sort of walk us through North Carolina because they enacted a voter ID law. We happen to have a great organization come to BigTent right when it was going down called You Can Vote North Carolina, another great nonpartisan group. I don't know if you partner with them, but Kate Fellman, who founded it and is the executive director, was just couldn't even say, like, I can't even talk about this yet because we don't have any guidance from the Secretary of State's office about what will be allowed. So I'd like you to sort of talk to us about what happens in a state and what happens to those people on the ground, the voters of North Carolina, when they enact a voter ID law, because I think it's representative of every other the 16 other states who've done the same thing.
Absolutely. And North Carolina is a great example, unfortunately, of sort of the two-pronged harm that comes when you implement a voter ID law, directly disenfranchising voters and also causing a ton of confusion. We saw this particularly in North Carolina because the ID law had been under litigation for years and years. So we actually had a team in place in North Carolina starting in 2020 in anticipation of the ID law potentially being implemented. But it was held up in the court for years. Voters were quite uncertain. There was actually no ID law in place in North Carolina in 2020 or in 2022, but we got tons of calls to our helpline from people who had read about the court case and read about it maybe being enacted, asking us for guidance on what do I need in the here and now today to bring to the polls. So in April 2023, in a really shocking move, frankly, the North Carolina State Supreme Court reversed its previous decision. They had previously ruled that the state's voter ID law was not constitutional because it had racially discriminatory impact. Then the partisan composition of the North Carolina Supreme Court changed. They decided to re-examine that case and found that their previous ruling no longer stood. So as of April 2023, North Carolina's voter ID law, after years of litigation, was enacted. It was enacted immediately, but a lot of times the folks who are charged with implementing the law at the polls, on a practical level, don't have the guidance they need. So as you noted, a lot of actors in North Carolina, from nonprofit groups like ours to parties and campaigns, to election administrators themselves, were waiting on sort of further administrative guidance. So the voter ID law in North Carolina is now in place. A lot of sort of confusing nuances to it, in that colleges and universities have to apply to have their student ID accepted as ID at the polls. So there's been a big effort to make sure that colleges and universities go ahead and do that. But that's sort of an extra step, an extra need to get the word out about ID, an extra layer of confusion where sort of you can't say it's black and white student ID, yes or no. It's a, well, if, and you have to go search the information. There's also been sort of confusion around, what is an accepted. So you can, if you go to the polls in North Carolina and don't have an accepted form of ID, you can sign a form to cast a ballot saying you meet one of several exceptions for not having an ID. But there was sort of confusion and a lack of clear guidance around what exceptions were good. All this to say, lots of confusion, huge need for our work at VoteRiders in terms of clear, accurate, up-to-date resources on accepted ID, on how to vote if you don't have that form of ID, on the ID you need to vote in person versus by mail, and also for the thousands of North Carolinians who don't have a form of accepted ID. We're really grateful to be on the ground and working with many partners right now to help them get a form of ID that will be accepted at the polls. No one wants to have the sort of intimidating experience of needing to ask a poll worker for a specific form, or not be sure if they're going to be able to vote, even if they take hours out of their day to wait in line and stand in line at the polls. So we are glad, we're not glad that it's harder to vote in North Carolina than it was just a couple of years ago, but we are grateful to be in partnership with so many organizations on the ground and to have been placed in North Carolina for years. We're also very grateful that all of your volunteers and many more are working with us to get the word out about this new ID law in North Carolina through letter writing, through text banking, through phone calls, through outreach, to make sure that we mitigate the impact that we know this law is going to have in November.
Yes, agreed. Susan Denny wants to ask sort of about, and I'm sure a lot of us have read this, that there is this effort by the Trump campaign to get some voters purged off voter rolls in key states. Susan mentioned Ohio, but it sounds like North Carolina is another one. Georgia is Pennsylvania, I think there is on their target list. So can you talk to us about what happens or how VoteRiders gets involved if a voter gets purged off a voter roll?
Yeah, so a couple things there. I mean, the most important thing we can take away is the only way to fight, voter suppression is through voter education and mobilization. So that's why we are a year-round organization working online and in communities to make sure that the folks who are most likely to get purged or to be purged because of being inactive voters are remembering to check their registration, to update it and re-register if needed, and make sure they have the ID they need to register and vote successfully in their state. We do a lot of sort of non-traditional work with site-based organizations like food banks and shelters and job fairs and low-income housing units that give us sort of trusted reach and access into the communities that are most likely to have at-risk voters of being purged, or to have registration difficulties or ID difficulties. That's how we sort of fight back with boots on the ground. Others are fighting back at the sort of, court level, through litigation about these voter purges and related efforts to suppress the vote. We're really this year head down doing the work every single day to make sure that we're part of the solution to that very real challenge that we know is out there.
That's great. I saw that Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson came to BigTent in early February, and she sent a letter to there's 16,000 Board of Canvassers. I don't know if that's what it's called in Michigan. That's what it's called in Rhode Island. And said cease and desist, like don't purge anymore, which I thought was really great. Anyways, my new friend Cheeky Cartagena asks, how are you working with Spanish voters in key states? She mentions Florida, Texas, Arizona, Georgia. How do you sort of, change your message to get into communities that are going to need extra help getting to the polls?
Yeah, great question. Language accessibility is front of mind for us, absolutely. All of our resources are bilingual in English and Spanish. So this is everything from our state websites to our voter ID information cards, the PSAs that we run on radio stations and that we play in movie theaters across the country, including in states like Arizona and Texas, are all bilingual in English and Spanish. If anyone knows or has access to Spanish-speaking volunteers, we're always looking for more to man our bilingual helpline and chatbot with voters who call with questions about ID or who want our help in getting ID. We have lots of bilingual organizers who work with us. We also partner closely with lots of organizations on the ground like Unidos US, with Voto Latino, with Mi Familia Vota, that have sort of an explicit organizing focus on the Latinx community to make sure that we are entering communities with accessible resources, and doing it, in a way that is authentic and through trusted partners.
That's great. So anyone who has Spanish-speaking friends, let VoteRiders know.
Yeah, I will note also on language accessibility, we do everything in English and Spanish. And in certain states, like in Michigan and Arizona, we've also worked with partners to translate our resources into additional languages. So in 2022, we had, I believe, 7 different API languages in which we were able to offer our voter ID information cards and other voter education sort of print material to make sure that we were speaking to people and offering resources and help in the language that was their preferred one.
Great. Can you talk to us a little bit more about this this sort of youth vote gerrymandering that seems to be running rampant in some states? Ohio, North Carolina, Georgia, I think in 2022, they changed who can use their student voter ID. So tell us a little bit about the student ID. I love that you brought up Texas. I find that appalling that you could use a gun license and not your student ID. So tell us a little bit more about student voter ID and what's happening across the country in that realm.
Yeah, 100%. And we also appreciate the term. We don't like that it exists, but demographic gerrymandering is something that you're able to do really effectively with something like voter ID laws. Ohio is a good example of this. In 2023, Ohio passed one of the country's strictest photo ID laws. They struck from the list of accepted IDs many options that we know from our organizing work were really popular on college campuses. So an example of this is a zero balance utility bill. So a utility bill used to be accepted at the polls for ID. So for lots of students who attended college or university in Ohio, but had their driver's license from back home in Pennsylvania, their dorm could print them a utility bill and they could go to the polls and cast a ballot, as is their right, where they reside in Ohio. This is no longer on the table. So we've heard a lot from our team on the ground in Ohio who do work with campus communities that the barriers now in place to casting a ballot in person are really being felt in a big way by students on campus there. Georgia is another example that I cite as very confusing and thorny when it comes to student ID and voter ID. In Georgia, you can use a student ID from a public college or university at the polls to cast a ballot successfully, but not from a private college or university. Several of the largest colleges and universities in the state, like Emory, are private. Also, importantly, a huge percentage, almost all of the state's HBCUs are private colleges and universities. So for students there, your student ID is not accepted at the polls. You have to find another way to cast a ballot or else you won't be able to do so. We could just go on and on. It's why we do a lot of work with the Students Learn, Students Vote Coalition, with NextGen, with lots of very youth-focused organizations to make sure that the really sort of hairy and thorny details around student ID as voter ID are communicated to students in a way that is accessible, that is not intimidating, and that makes sense. We also, I think I mentioned this, we have a landing page on our website at voteriders.org/student to make sure that students know there is a dedicated resource for their ID needs and a dedicated organization like VoteRiders that's there to help them. And this was always an organizing focus and priority for us. When we did the new research that I mentioned, it became even more important because age was the single most powerful predictor of whether or not an individual had a government issued photo ID with their current name and address on it. And really sort of the youngest future voters, the ones that we should be most actively inviting in and activating are the ones who are hands down the most harmed by voter ID laws, and the ones we and all of us are going to have to work harder to reach this year and beyond.
Sorry, it seems like the other piece of that is just making certain Americans just feel very disenfranchised and cynical. So the cynicism is sort of part of the point too, in a way.
Yeah, and all of the research shows, the sooner in your life you start to vote and make it a habit, the more likely you are to be a habitual lifetime voter. So the sort of compounding effect of disenfranchising young people at their first opportunity to cast a ballot is something that's really daunting, which is why we are investing so many resources in reaching and activating young people in spite of the rising barriers.
Yeah. Tracy B put in the chat, and I would pull my hair up like this, like a hair on fire. Like, how the heck do they get away with that? All caps. It's true. Martin Grover had a really great question about military IDs. Are those accepted as a proper voter ID in certain states?
So in certain states, yes. So there are a couple forms of ID that are accepted in every single state. And that is just a in-state unexpired driver's license or state ID card. In almost every other state, there are additional options. Sometimes it's a military ID, sometimes it's a passport. In some states like Michigan that have what I would say is an example of a more inclusive voter ID law, you can bring a non-photo ID, like a utility bill or a pay stub. So it really varies by state, to your question, Martin. But the good news is if you go to the VoteRiders website and look up any given state, you can see a list of all of the accepted forms of ID and see if military ID is on there.
Great, thank you. Susie McKay, asked, for individuals in your targeted states who aren't affiliated with any group, how would you suggest they find a group or a way to participate as an individual? Letter writing, yes, and how to work with voter ID challenge individuals in their states. Any recommendations for Susie?
How to become a volunteer with VoteRiders?
Yes, I think
Yes.
that's the question.
Yes, yes. Almost all of our 10,000 volunteers are doing so in their individual capacity. So you can go to our website, it's voteriders.org/volunteer, enter your email address in the form at the bottom, and you'll get automatically added to the volunteer segment of our email list at least once a week for probably the remainder of this year through November. You'll be given different opportunities to plug in. So this could be anything from a one-time 1-hour virtual letter writing effort to a text bank, to getting trained to be a helpline or chatbot volunteer, to getting trained. We do monthly orientation sessions for folks who want to learn how to be an ID assistance volunteer. So lots of ways to get involved as an individual, particularly on our ID assistance work. Something that I really love is you see sort of communities of volunteers start to emerge from folks who joined in their individual capacity. So a lot of sort of, on our helpline and chatbot Slack channel, you see this as well. Lots of sort of mutual support from like-minded volunteers across the country who have signed up through VoteRiders to do this work together.
Great. And that link is in the chat too. Before we end, I just want just talk to us a little bit more, because people are very fired up to write letters with you. And we are very excited to partner with you in 2024, like we did in the last 3 election cycles. So just talk to us about why letters are so effective.
Absolutely. Letters are incredibly effective because, like I was saying before, it is rare to get a handwritten letter in your mailbox. Especially as we get closer to November, when many of our inboxes and cell phones are just going to be inundated and the spam filters are going to be working full speed. A handwritten letter is such an effective way to reach a voter and make them feel personally invited to participate. Letters also really work well for us as vote writers. You probably all know there are character limits to text messages, and only so much information you can get across on a teeny little screen. We have a pre-printed letterhead for every single state that has the whole list of IDs that you can use at the polls. It has information on election deadlines. It has information and a QR code for how to get help from VoteRiders and find out what ID you need to vote by mail. So letters are just a great medium for us in particular in delivering complicated information in one accessible sheet. It's something you can keep with you and have as a reference guide, share with your community. I can't say enough about letters. I see Lori's comment. Agree. Older adults, letters are tried and tested. I refute the fact that they are old school. I see the impact they have, and we saw that in the example from Texas. Final plug for our letter writing efforts is that they are hyper targeted to make sure that we're getting the exact right voters, the exact right information they need at the exact right time so that they can successfully vote. We do lots of open records requests like we did in Texas. We're doing those in every single one of our target states to make sure that we're getting hyper targeted contact lists of voters to send letters to. So folks who are registered but who don't have ID on file, folks who cast a ballot in 2022 with a form of ID that is no longer accepted at the polls. So it's a really great investment of time. It's so important, and also something you can do on your own time with friends, listening to music with us. Great activity. Can't plug it enough, and thank you for your support in that activity enough.
Well, Lauren, thank you so much for coming to Big Tent. We appreciate everyone who came to the call and everyone who's signing up for letters. We will have a lot of letters available at activism@bigtentusa.org. So please shoot us an email. We hope you'll come back. We really appreciate your work and all that you're doing to support Americans getting to the polls this fall and into the future. So, with that, I'm going to close the call. Take a look. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.